What's up, Dragon Brood? We all know one of the things that sucks is if you waste some of your wild cards on something that doesn't work out or that you don't want later, you're kind of stuck with it. So this video is to help you know maybe some things you hadn't thought about to slow you down on crafting some things in Aetherdrift Standard. And we're going to be focusing mostly on the rares and mythics because those are the ones that matter the most, and we all kind of have enough commons and uncommon wild cards to not have to worry about it too much. But if you do want to get some of these cards in paper, don't forget to check out our sponsor over at Tales of Adventure. You can use code DRAGON, DRAGN. It'll save you 5%, and they'll keep supporting the channel. So I appreciate it. Or if you just want to get one of these sweet shirts, check out the merch store down below. It's available with a bunch of other neat stuff. Anyway, let's talk about some things you probably shouldn't craft here in Aetherdrift in the early going. In Aetherdrift. Oh my god. Anyway, let's talk about some cards. All right, I know. You probably looked at this Aether Spark and went, what? Okay, let me preface this with something else for the video. Some of these cards might be good later. I'm not saying any of these cards are trash. I'm not saying you should never craft them. I'm just saying if you're looking to spin wild cards early, some of the decks that may eventually exist for these cards aren't necessarily known yet, or we haven't seen any examples of where these cards are superior. I also want to throw out another thing here about the Aether Spark is that it is an artifact, and we're already seeing a lot of people starting to trend toward main deck artifact removal for all of these different vehicles that are being brought back from the graveyard, all of the gear hulks that happen to also be artifact creatures. So kind of collateral damage also hits the Aether Spark. Now, I will say this, the times it does work, it's going to be great. It's one of those cards with a super high ceiling, but also a very low floor, like below the basement level. And that's just the way it's going to be, right? You need a creature to put this on. Like, the creature has to not get hit during combat or die during combat. Then you need the Aether Spark to also not get removed so you don't get busted by a combat trick. There's a few things that have to go right for this card to work. But the only time I saw it perform well so far has been when I was already behind and the opponent's deck just kind of did its thing. The other times the opponent got it, we actually beat it. So I think it can be a powerful card. Just right now, we don't know where to put it so it's at its best use. So if you think you got a plan, go for it. But I would slow my roll a little bit. And even if you do, you probably shouldn't try to make 4 of them. 1 or 2 will probably do you now for the early season. Man, I just realizing some of the things I said about the Aether Spark kind of also apply to Radiant Lotus. Though Radiant Lotus is also more expensive. Now, you can play like mana artifacts that will make it easier to craft this or play it. And that kind of makes sense because then you can just toss those and get extra mana later, which is good. But it does need a little bit of setup. And the decks you're putting it in, you might just have a better way to kill somebody just building it more traditionally, other than trying to go with the gimmick of the Radiant Lotus. Again, I don't think the card's bad, and there may be multiple decks this goes into. Right now, though, I think I saw one that kind of worked well, so I can't say confidently that this is one you need to go and craft. And the tough part about this one is I feel like if you do decide to play it, you're probably going to need 3 for sure, possibly 4 in the decks you want to play it, so you can get it to pop off and do the big thing you want. And that makes it more of a risk. So I would wait until things are kind of more clear on the uses for this and see if it shows up in more than one deck. Because part of the problem too is if you do craft it and there's only one good deck for it, you're kind of going to be stuck playing that deck until you acquire more resources. Unstoppable Plan is one that I think the consensus as a whole so far has been, we like the words on this card, but we don't know what to do with it. That's pretty much the sentiment I'm getting from everybody. All the creators, deck builders, pro players I know. There's probably some fun things you can do with this, but the problem is, as hostile and aggressive as sometimes as the current standard can be, will you even have enough time to take turn 3 or 4 off to play this, then untap, take advantage of the thing that's in play? Like, I don't know, honestly. Probably not. Now, I do think if you're wanting to play this in Commander, or maybe even on Arena if you want to play it in Brawl, there might be some uses there that make it okay. But I think for Standard, especially for Best of 1, I would pause on this one until we see some little more clarity, some better uses on what you can do with this, because right now, I think you're setting yourself up for a thing that potentially happens, yet it may not even be big enough to matter compared to the other simpler things your opponents are doing. So while I do like this card in theory, and I like kind of what it says you can do, we don't really know what we're trying to do. So I would just wait till things come into focus a little more on this one. Muyan Ling Wind Rider is a very interesting one because it feels like the type of card that might get better in future standard, and right now might not just be the time for it. And for two reasons. I think there are better blue-white things and even blue-red things you could do that involve artifacts, but don't necessarily all have to be vehicles. And like this thing making a 3/2 vehicle body is kind of cool, but it's for most decks gonna be worse than playing the Enduring Curiosity, right? Because then every creature that hits your opponent, you get a card for, and that also has flash. It is only a 3 toughness, but it's a 4 power, so it has other things going for it. And I think since people already invested in that card, the Enduring Curiosity is probably going to be the choice for most people. And if you're going to be playing artifacts, I don't know if you need to be leaning heavy on Mu Yan Ling. Now, could you play like one of maybe in some of your artifact decks if they play vehicles? Like, sure, I don't think it hurts. But this isn't one I would go out and try to craft multiples of. Like, feel free, craft one as an experiment, see how it works. If it fits your deck that you're building, awesome. Go ahead and craft some more. But I wouldn't start out just jumping on the bandwagon on this one. So far, I looked around and I hadn't seen anything that anybody played, even in the streamer event or anything that's been posted online here, that looks like it would take super use of this card to a level that's better than other things we already have. So for this one, this is another one that while the words read really nice, probably one I'm going to back off on here for at least the first couple of weeks. Next up is Vinwixt. I think that's how you say that. Verburst Host. I actually, I just realized I'm not hating on blue cards, by the way. We actually have some blue cards in our other video of things you should craft, so feel free to check that one out after this. But I think the problem with this card is it doesn't help itself set up, and so far, I couldn't really find a spot where it would go, right? The stuff that cares about getting up, starting your engines, get your speed up, tend to be decks that are being more aggressive. And we see a whole variety of blue-white aggressive things. Some doing the affinity things, some have other things that care about artifact creatures, but most of them aren't playing things that also draw extra cards. Or at least not enough of them that having it on a creature to let you draw extra would matter. So maybe just because it counts the turn, because it does say whenever you would draw a card, so I mean that counts the turn, so now you draw 2 instead of 1, and maybe that's good enough. It is an 0/4, so I mean it could block a few things, but it is also legendary, so it has that going against it. So I think this is another one that there's probably going to be a good use for this card at some point. I just don't know what it is right now, and I think you're going to spend more resources and be disappointed experimenting with it until things are kind of figured out on what type of deck this goes into. There might be something that plays like the eidetic memory and you're drawing other cards with creatures, and like maybe that's a thing, but even then you have to figure out like how are we doing the whole start your engines, get your up to max speed. It's going to be a thing that has to be figured out. So regardless, this is one that again maybe in Commander, maybe in Brawl, there's probably some good uses for it, but for right now in 60 card standard, I'm not too excited for this here in the first couple of weeks. All right, and if there's a card I want to be so wrong about on this list, it's Captain Howler Sea Scourge. I played a deck in the streamer event with this card, and it just didn't work out the way we wanted it to. Like, it has all the right words, right? It's 4 mana, it's a 5/4, it has a cool ward ability. There's a bunch of cards that already let you discard for benefits, so this just piggybacks on those. But for some reason, we just couldn't get it to work. And then the times we did, it just wasn't as powerful as we wanted it to be. I kind of saw the same thing from other people as well. And then several of the decks that were doing the is it discard bonus thing weren't even playing this and doing well. So I don't know if that just means we hadn't figured it out, or maybe there's a better world for it. Maybe it goes into some weird pirate builds. All of those are probably realistic possibilities, but as it stands, haven't seen this perform well yet. It's been disappointing pretty much every time, which is wild when you look at the card because that doesn't look like that should be the case. Feel free to keep experimenting with it, but I wouldn't craft more than 1 or 2. Just be aware that I don't even know if I could say the floor is low. It's just like we just haven't figured out the best use for it yet. But yeah, I want this one to be good. So if there's one on the list I'm going to be wrong about, I'm hoping it's this. Maybe it won't happen in the first couple of weeks, but later in the season, here's hoping we get to see this shark in action. You have Chandra, Spark Hunter. This is going to be an interesting one because I don't think that this card's particularly bad. What I do think, though, is it's not... I think more people will lose games playing it like a regular Planeswalker than they should. This doesn't play like a traditional planeswalker where you can play it while you're behind and maybe make a body and block and buy yourself some time and then slowly get ahead and do this thing. This doesn't really do that, right? You're making a body that unfortunately can't block on its own. So you almost have to have another creature to take advantage of it to protect your planeswalker. And I would actually say if it's going to see a lot of play, it might actually be because of the third ability that when you get the emblem, then all of your artifacts are able to start dealing damage. That might be how this gets played more than even caring that it's making a vehicle necessarily. Don't know that to be true, but I could see worlds where that's possible. So far, though, the times I saw it, it wasn't super spectacular unless you were already ahead. But at that point, the question becomes like, what else would be good if you're already ahead? Now, I will say it does still have the benefit of being a planeswalker. So after your opponent sweeps the board, it happened to have made vehicles. So those are still around and you can attack with something. So that's nice. But beyond that, I don't know. Still good against control matchups and stuff if you are playing a more aggressive deck and you want to just have a backup plan. Nothing wrong with it. But again, not one I would go crazy for. It is cheap to cast at only 4 mana and only one of it being red. But this is another one that I think we're going to have to wait to see the best deck that utilizes this card. Because so far, I don't think we know what it is. You know, I was kind of down on Sita Varma Masked Racer in the preview season when we were talking about cards, and honestly, I came back around to it and still not super excited about it. Though I do think there is one build if you went blue-white +1/+1 tokens, like you could probably play 2 or 3 copies of this and be fine. But that's one very specific deck. I don't think this goes into a lot of things. And I think this is the type of card you have to be careful with. Because while it is fun, if you do like the +1/+1 counters in blue and green, like, okay, I could see why you'd want to play this card. But then the problem is it doesn't really fit into anything else, right? So are you going to blow up some rare wild cards to build this to only really play it in exactly one deck? Because I don't think there's that many variations of that deck once we figure out what the best version is. So that's a little concerning to me. So I think that's why I ended up putting it on the list. It's several of the other 2 mana, 2/3, I guess, pilot type creatures or key cards, creature characters in the set, I guess I will refer to them. They tend to have more uses, and I can see more corner cases where they could fit into different things. But I feel like this one is very restricted to exactly one deck, unfortunately. Doesn't really matter that it's an exhaustibility, but maybe. I mean, it does at least let you get the 4/2 goblin back out of the graveyard if you use it, so that's kind of cool. But yeah, it feels pretty limiting, and I think that's the concern here. Like, does it have potential upside? Absolutely. And the upside could be very high. The problem is, for most of the decks you're going to put it in, it's just not going to do much. So I would steer clear of this unless you're building that one very specific deck. Next up is Ovia Automech Artisan. And this is one that I want to be good, but it just hasn't gotten there. And here's the thing, like giving all your stuff trample is actually really good. So that part, excellent. The downside is that it's 4 mana for a 1/2 creature. And you still have to have it live a turn until you can actually put something from your hand on the battlefield because it has an actual tap ability. So 4 mana for a 1/2 is just not cutting it as far as creatures in current standard. And having to wait a full turn cycle before you take advantage of it is also very tough. And we have a lot of ways to trick things onto the battlefield, right? We can turn stuff from the graveyard. We can play stuff like Kona that lets it just go from hand into play. Like we have reanimator spells. Like there's so many other things. So if we're trying to just get a creature onto the battlefield, there's just much more efficient ways to do it with other cards that also don't have the drawbacks that this one has. So I like it. It does allow itself to do potentially some very big things. And, you know, tricking some big dumb vehicles into play could be awesome. But realistically, probably not how we're going to go about it. It just doesn't make enough sense. I wanted to, don't get me wrong. Being able to, like, just put something from your hand in the battlefield is huge. We've had other cards like that that have really been able to do it. But I think in this current standard, this just isn't the way. And so far, I've only seen like 3 different people, I think, try to play with it. And it was pretty much abysmal each time. So there's probably a world in the future. You know, I'm not going to never say never here. But right now, I would not waste wild cards on this, at least in the first couple of weeks. If the format slows down and it becomes more of a mid-rangey control type thing, then, you know, maybe. But we're still going to have the Konas and the Smuggler Surprise and everything else that are probably just going to be better. And I don't want this list to scare anybody off of, like, if you really want to build it, go for it. It's your resources. You might have a sweet idea that we haven't seen yet, and it might work perfectly. This is more of just like, if you're on the fence, this can help you kind of slow down till you see some stuff if you weren't so sure about the card. And don't forget, we will have the other video that hopefully will be linked here, and you can just go check that out so you can see the stuff that you should craft that is overperformed here in the early part of the season. So, help you make some decisions. But that's all I have for you for now. We'll see you next time.